And welcome to Racism in America, an expert panel discussion. My name is Bridget McGowan-Hawkins. I'm just going to moderate the chat for you today, make sure everybody is getting their questions answered and making sure everybody is getting into the session. And speaking of getting your questions answered, if you do have questions during the course of the panel discussion, please post them to the chat, and at the appropriate time, I'll make sure you get your answers. I'll make sure those questions get to our experts on the panel today. Additionally, thank you if you have already muted yourself, and if you have already disengaged your video. If you've not done so, then please mute yourself and please turn off your video. Thank you for taking care of that. Next, to introduce our incredible leader in this conversation, our moderator, if you will, for the conversation is Simone Morris. Simone Morris is the founder of Simone Morris Enterprises, LLC. The firm is a minority women-owned business that provides solutions for career growth as well as inclusive leadership. Simone has a 20-year-plus track record in corporate America. Today, she focuses on sharing her thought leadership in her business as well as across various platforms. She is passionate about helping in the fight against racism and has created panels like this one to unify others ready to take this inclusive journey. With that, I am going to turn things over to Simone.
Welcome, 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 everybody. I am so excited for this second panel, having this discussion on how to fight racism, such an important topic in the time that we are living in. I am deeply honored for the people who have said yes. And not just yes to me, yes to the world in the work that they are doing to fight racism. Let me begin to welcome our panelists. First up, I want to welcome Keith Stokes. He is the Vice President at 1696 Heritage Group. And Keith, I met him online and was just fascinated at his knowledge about racial history and the work that he does. I invited him to the Inclusion School podcast, and he schooled Julie Kratz and myself. And I said to myself, he needs to be on the panel because I think we need some understanding about why people are so upset. And it's not just George Floyd, it's a lot more than that. And Keith is going to give us some history as we start out. Next up, I want to welcome Dr. Shirley Davis. Her name is recognized in the world of D&I. She's a seasoned HR executive. I have been such a fan of her work and have taken her mastermind group, and she is just a rock star. You will see what I mean shortly. So welcome, Dr. Shirley. Can't wait to hear what you have to say about this topic and what corporations are doing. Next up, Kelly Charles Collins, who is a retired employment attorney and who has a TEDx on the bystander effect. So important. We are going to talk about that in this conversation. Next up is Danielle Nava-Mijares. Danielle, welcome. Danielle is an anti-racist educator. We met on Facebook. She's doing some wonderful work, and I knew she needed to be a part of this conversation and talk to us about allyship. Liesel Mertes. Liesel is a rock star as well. She is so calming, and we need her to tell us about empathy. That is the work she does as an empathy expert in the workplace, and she's going to be talking to us about strategies we can use in this season. Welcome, everybody.
Great to be here. Awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, let's jump right in. Keith, I want you to school us with some race education. Tell us what we need to know, just some basics in understanding how we got to where we are today and the outrage and just concern about what's happening in the world.
Oh, thanks, Simone. I don't know if I can do 400 years of history in 5 minutes, but at least I can provide at least a perspective on the history of African heritage people and the racism that we've endured over those 400 years. I think as a starting point, it's important to recognize that during these days of social unrest and for the Black Lives Matter movement, and really essentially a civil rights movement. It's fascinating for someone like me who has my own children, are ninth generation residents of Newport, Rhode Island, as residents of color. And Newport, which is our home today, was not only one of the most active slave ports in British North America, but it's also home to several of America's most prominent African-American civic, education, religious institutions that had their beginnings right in my community. But much of this information is largely unknown. So let me begin with the experiences of African heritage people in America. The challenge is that they are far too often defined by our struggles to overcome enslavement and the follow-on racial discrimination that many white Americans really do not know much about us. And it's almost ironic to the fact that there's so lack of knowledge of African-American people, our culture, and our history. And we've only been in America since its very founding. And if you look at some of the research, it consistently states that, and this is the most troubling aspect, is there's scant interpersonal contact between white and Black Americans. And what I've consistently experienced is that far too many white Americans have very little personal experiences and interactions with African heritage people through either shared work, worship, and even living experiences. And it's this lack of simple human interaction, coupled with the advent of social media, which we're doing today, it just leaves far too many people to receive their interpretation of who we are as African Americans, more so on the internet rather than person-to-person interaction. So for me, what's most troubling is that far too many white Americans, they have the choice and privilege to where they live, where to send their children to school, where to vacation, where to work. And this all allows them to avoid thinking about the annoying things like racial inequality and the ongoing history of violence towards Black men and women. So as a historian, and I've been actively involved in urban community development, I find the greatest challenge facing African heritage people today in America, particularly during this time of Black Lives Matter movement, is that far too much of our African American experience, past, present, and even the future, it's being interpreted through almost an owner's class viewpoint. There's more of a public presentation discussions on the lives of an enslaver rather than the enslaved. And what's most troubling is the light that we have reams of primary source documentation across America that brings to life who we are and who we can be as African heritage men, women, and children. So I just want to emphasize that here in 2020, invisibility can be as destructive to African heritage people as overt racism. And let me say that again. Invisibility can be as destructive to African heritage people as overt racism. So I also hear a lot today from white Americans who say that they're waking up to racism. And I've even heard the phrase coined that they've become anti-racism activists. But if these same woke activists have little knowledge of our African heritage and history in America, how can they be truly aware of our African experience today and in the future? So I think for African Americans, we have been through this cycle of what I've seen as short-term liberalism before. We saw it in the abolitionist movement in the 19th century. We certainly saw it in the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. But what was needed then and what we still require today is to build a new generation of leadership that fully empowers African heritage men, women, and children to receive their full and equal standing in areas of economic, health, and educational equity. And finally, let me speak as an historian, because this is important to me. I've had the honor to travel and work with African heritage scholars across the African diaspora. And what I found is a new and vibrant way to reconnect our shared history. It's by recognizing the factual stories of the people, than just simply recounting the stories of the institutions and the events that continue to dehumanize us. Today, Confederate statues and memorials that celebrate those that secured fame through racial or ethnic religious oppression, it's just not the history that America, that is the growing majority of America, will tolerate anymore. But I just suggest that rather than simply taking statues down or removing state names, we should also be advancing African heritage and history, particularly in our public schools, and reclaiming public spaces that include memorials that represent all the people. America today, in the midst of this Black Lives Matter movement, has the time and the opportunity to lead the world in how we tell a more inclusive history of all Americans through public memorials, public spaces, and public education. And why promote African American history as a means to reduce racism? Because history should always be a collective memory of its people, and education should not only be inclusive, but empowering for early learners. Right now in my state of Rhode Island, I'm actively engaged in working with all different organizations, institutions, economic, political, social, religious. And our goal is to build an African-American history curriculum for all K-12 public schools. Hopefully this leads this activity all across the country. It's action like this in public education that I believe passionately will reduce racism and advance true American unity. What I'm simply saying and what I'm looking forward to dialogue is that as Black Lives Matter, so does Black history. So thank you, Simone, for having me on.
Well said, Keith. I really appreciate the historic viewpoint just to level set us on what's happening. Let me go over to Dr. Shirley. Dr. Shirley, you travel around the country quite a bit. In response to what Keith is saying about Black History Matters as well, how have you seen corporations respond to the Black Lives Matter movement and the necessity to incorporate Black history into the workplace? Can you talk to us about that?
Are you wanting to talk about more specifically the recent events or in general?
Well, let's start with the recent events.
Good. So with recent events, I will say to all of you, I have not traveled for the last 3.5 months, and I don't plan on traveling for another 3 months. Even though I do travel 80 to 90% of the time, I am good with just going down the street to the grocery store and coming right back with my mask. But for the last couple of weeks, though, obviously given some of the really unfortunate incidents that we've all observed, and I don't have to call all the names, I think we can all certainly relate to that. So we have been slammed, right? So, March and April and May was a bit of, oh my God, we've lost all of this business. But now it's like, oh my God, we've got all of this business. But much of it has come because people have reached out immediately wanting to talk about, what do we do as far as getting out a statement, right? So there was a huge rush to, you got to do something. And I do believe, and I think it's very important, you got to say something and you got to be timely. You got to be responsive quickly, right? Be very, very reactive. And it was important to get a statement out and to really talk about the commitment to having, one, your values tied to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ensuring that everyone feels valued and respected. And it was also important as they, put the statement out, recognizing it can't just be a statement. Now you got to do something beyond that statement. So we have been doing listening sessions, and we're scheduled for about 50 or 60 of them over the next 4 to 6 weeks. Thank you, Kelly. Kelly's helping me with some of those as well, too. But I mean, our team, we've got a team of 12 of us, and 6 of us on the team are doing nothing but listening sessions. And it's focused specifically on racism, because I do know that there is the inclination that people have when they come to these sessions of, oh, I want to talk about, my sexual orientation. I want to talk about my religion. I want to talk about my disability. I want to talk about being an immigrant. And there's room and place for that, just not this time, not this time. We're being very responsive to the moment right now and taking this moment and turning it into a movement. We'll talk about that in the training and education, but right now let's talk about racism, something that most corporations have been uncomfortable with doing, and in a lot of ways, it's in their policies not to talk about these taboo, sensitive topics. So it's great that listening sessions are going on. Some other things that are happening too is, in addition to the listening sessions, so once you listen, then you got to know that there's something to do about that. Because the way we do our listening sessions is we do want to ask them at the end, as we wrap it up, what next? Where do we move from here? What are some of the things that your organization can do to create a more equitable, welcoming, and an inclusive culture? What can you do to move forward in your healing? What kind of support do you need? And also allies, those of you who are not directly affected, not a part of the African-American experience, what can you do as an ally? And I know we'll talk a bit about that. Some of the other things that's been happening too is Juneteenth, which was never, ever really a conversation about holidays. That became now the big push. Let's do something immediately to show our commitment and solidarity with the Black community. I'm happy about it because, y'all know this on the phone, but all of you who are joined, Juneteenth is my birthday, so I was celebrating it anyway. But clearly, it is something that was an opportunity for organizations to now learn more about our history. Most people didn't know that in 1863, that's when slaves were freed. And yet not clearly freed, because there's still a lot of systemic and institutional racism and oppression. The other things that I've seen, obviously now we're doing a lot more. They're asking for DE&I audits. So they really want to pinpoint where are their inequities, where are their gaps, where can they really deal with their systemic and institutional racism, discriminatory practices, or inequities. The other things that they're doing, and this one is kind of funny. One of my chief diversity officer colleagues and close friends works at a global organization and had been a victim of furlough during the coronavirus. So was laid off and was told that, you know, effective July 1, we're gonna have to let you go. Well, when all of this stuff happened, the CEO called him personally on a Sunday morning and said, never mind, we retract that statement. Your voice is needed more than ever before. And his job was reinstated, not just temporarily, but permanently. So that's a good thing that came out of that. But I'm also seeing more companies now establishing offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion, those who hadn't had it before. They've called us even about establishing a long-term DE&I strategic plan. So those are some of the things that they're doing. They have created grant programs. They're one to now invest in the Black community. They've been putting up money now. They have found all of this money that they didn't have budget for. They didn't found money to contribute to Black advocacy groups like Black Lives Matter, NAACP, Urban League, the Thurgood Marshall Scholarship Fund, all kinds of HBCUs. So that's a good thing. It's really pushing the envelope and helping people to see that this is key and critical. And one or two other things I would say too that I've been seeing is a real push to have something long-term. Yeah, so we're doing training, we're doing education, focusing now more on, let's talk about systemic racism. Let's have the conversation, but let's do some training about what that looks like. But also they're doing training and education on unconscious biases and how that plays out in the workplace and what is microaggressions and how we can be more sensitive. As a matter of fact, Kelly and I are doing a session coming up for another organization called, you know, blind spots, right? How they can cost you your business, not just as a speaker or consultant, but they can cost you your business as an organization. I mean, one of the things I'm so excited about was there's an organization, huge company, I want to say it was Etsy. One of the board members stepped down from the board. He was a white guy and he said, look, I'm giving up my seat. I'm going to step down and I am going to require that my seat be filled with an African-American. And within a week, the company did it. And so those are the kinds of things, we've never seen that before. So it's exciting to see how companies are, you know, maximizing the moment, but this moment has to be turned into a long-term movement. And I think they're serious about it because if they don't, I know that they see that there is a real push for protest, right? There's a real appetite for it and they will come and protest. Some of them are sitting in front of my clients' organizations. Some of them have been there for a week and they're not leaving until the company makes changes. So that's the kind of stuff that's happening now. So it's exciting, but yet a little scary for companies, but it is an opportunity now. It's a watershed moment to really be a part of change.
Woo, Dr. Shirley. You know, I'm glad to hear that there is more than I know about going on. I really am, because I've seen some of the statements coming out and I've also seen some companies being quiet. And I'm glad that you said now is not the time to be quiet, because honestly, being quiet is, there's narrative associated with that. So you're best to put some narrative with that. I want to go over to Danielle and ask her about allyship. Dr. Shirley mentioned allyship in her conversation. Tell us about some of the work you're doing or what people can do to be better allies in this season.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm feeling fired up. I'll just say that. Let me just start with saying that the word ally is earned. It is not self-proclaimed. So for folks who feel like, hey, I'm an ally, unless someone from the community has honored you with that, please recognize that that is reserved for people who are recognizing that we are not the experts in Black experience. We are not the experts in BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color experiences. And to be an ally requires not only deep listening, but deep hearing, right? And that is, there's a difference. I see you, I feel you, whatever that might be, and I'm listening to you, but it's, are you hearing me? And the other thing I think great allies do are learning to see what you have not been conditioned to see. And that's going to require a lot of discomfort and a lot of homework. See, I think a great ally, a strong ally, recognizes that it's not the job for us to speak up and speak out for us. I think allyship is not centering the ally as a mouthpiece, but rather it is making sure that when Black women, Black men, Black folk are in the room, that they're stepping back and amplifying that. They're acknowledging the work that has been done. I often hear people say, I want to do this work, and they come from well-intentioned places. I want to do this work and I want to be a voice for the voiceless. And I always say, like, let me offer this. You don't need to be a voice for the voiceless, because Black folks and other people of color have voice. You all are just not listening, and you are not believing. And that is being able to know when to step up and when to step back. So I want to make sure that I feel so strongly about that, because I think it's about allyship is being more than a supporter. It's about being a co-conspirator, or even an accomplice. And I know to some folks that might feel like, woo, that feels like very strong, but it really is. It's about being committed to restructuring and redesigning systems that we know hurt Black folks and other people of color. And so that takes me to thinking about allyship. I have been bombarded, and Simone and I have not had the down and dirty conversation, and I'm aching for that, because I'm having that with people who are in my circle of influence. But I said, y'all, I have never seen so many posts about Juneteenth. I've never seen so many Black Lives Matter, but then the narrative, it's either there's no narrative, or it's a conversation that almost rings of like all lives matter, because they want to start bringing in LGBTQ, religion, and all that matters. But what is necessary to be uplifting, because clearly it is not being heard, is that Black lives matter, right? And so it's more than just doing the soup of the day of hashtagging. It's really engaging in necessary education and making sure that it is us as allies who are doing the homework and not relying on our BIPOC friends to teach us. That is not the job. And an ally will recognize, like, I cannot put more on this person, that is on me. I also know how to Google. So if I want to ask advice and say, like, can you point me in a direction, that's one thing. But to Google, don't ask me what microaggression is. Look it up, figure that out. The other thing is, I offer to folks is to resist simple solutions to very complex issues. It is not about, if we could just be kind and nice to each other. Now, y'all realize that I work in education, and so being nice, yeah, I'm not advocating for not being nice, but I'm also saying be real. There are simple solutions for bringing people together, and this conversation requires much more complexity and the understanding of that. And then I guess finally, there's two final things, and then I'll be quiet, I promise, is to resist equity over peace. During the uprisings that we experienced, whether we were on the front lines or we were watching or listening, that people were so concerned, like, why can't we just have peace? This is not peaceful. This is not. And I would say, if you are more concerned with people in the uprise and the movement, and you forgot the why, then you're prioritizing having peace and harmony and safety for you over what the real issues are. So peace without justice is inauthentic justice. It is not real. And so I invite people who say, I want to be an ally, I want to be in this race. It's a constant reminder to myself that I need to hold myself accountable for the pain that I have inadvertently caused and the pain that my community causes. I mean, there is no issues that there are there's no secret that there are issues between Black and brown communities. And that's also, I have commentary about what that design looks like from a societal perspective and a sociological perspective. I think, I know lots of folks talk about discomfort, and there's many people, many shades of people talking about that. But what I will say to this is that committing to being anti-racist is messy, and it can be painful, and you will be uncomfortable. And if you're not uncomfortable in having these conversations, that means you've gotten too comfortable, or you missed the conversation where it made you uncomfortable. And so I will just say this, that do the work. Please do not, you know, if you want to use words that folks are comfortable, lean into that discomfort, get used to it, make it a friend, because as soon as it's a friend, you got to move on to the next to make sure that you're uncomfortable again. And those are the things that I'm having conversations with my students. And I also want to uplift that it is some of my students who continue to light that fire. It's a constant amount of work that goes into it. So unless folks are ready to do the work, please do not co-opt the word ally.
Drop the mic. There are some amazing people on this panel. I told you guys, just amazing. Thank you for sharing that perspective on allyship. And personally, you know, as Black people as well, there's a lot of work and learning for us to do, because there's a lot of things that weren't taught in school. So we are learning as well. So I'm glad you said what you did. Now, Kelly, I want to move over to you, because I heard your interview with Minda Harts talking about the bystander effect and how important bystanders, how important their role was in the George Floyd case, and how they stepped up to help. And I'm hearing people say, I don't know how to help. And I'm also hearing people say that they're calling out some people at work. And so this is your zone of genius. Talk to us about how we show up as bystanders. How do we do it well in the workplace and outside of the workplace?
Okay, so what I want you to do is show up. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, what I want you to do is show up as an advocate, not as a bystander, right? So when we think about when we see something happening, there's a spectrum of the people who are involved. So we have perpetrators, we have accomplices, we have bystanders, we have allies, and I'll talk about allies because I think allies are passive, and then we have advocates, right? And so the whole concept of bystander is that when there are a group of people around and an incident is happening, we're less likely as individuals to intervene because we think that other people are more qualified or someone else will just take care of it, right? So we usually don't step in. We saw the whole spectrum in the George Floyd incident. So we saw Chauvin as the perpetrator. We saw the two officers as the accomplices. We saw Cal, who was standing there. He was an accomplice and a bystander. We saw allies, right? People were just who were around and watching, but they were being passive, but they were trying to make sure that something happened. And then we had the advocates, which were the people who were yelling and screaming and taking video, right? And so in our lives, we have to see where we are on that spectrum, and the place where you should be is on advocacy. So I know Danielle talked about allies, and people use that word a lot. I believe that word to be very passive because, like she said, anyone could just say, hey, I'm an ally. And so allies generally are people who say, yeah, I understand, or I hear you. So we have a lot of people right now talking about they want to be listeners and learners. Yeah, I want you to be a listener and a learner, but I want you to be a doer, right? Because doing is what makes change. You listening and learning, you can put that away. I need you to do something about it. And so as a lawyer, I've always been an advocate. I speak up for people. I speak on behalf of people. I speak in their best interest. And so when you are in this situation, if you want to be anti-racist, you have to become a doer. You have to become an action taker. You have to speak up. And so I know that people, when we're talking about allyship, they want to say, well, no, sit back because you don't want to speak over. The great thing about being an advocate is that you know your role, right? And you understand the power in your voice. and you understand when to use your voice. And so if you take on that role as opposed to being an ally and kind of being afraid of what you're supposed to do or not, what you're not doing something, you'll understand the power in being that person. And so as Black people, we don't need you to just sit by and say nothing or to just hold our hand or rub our back. That's not going to help us, right? Because there are times when we actually do need you to speak up. There are times when we're not in a room where we need you to use your voice, or when we are in that room and our voice is being silenced or we're being ignored, or as Keith talked about, we're invisible. We're there, but we're invisible, and that we need you to speak up. And in those spaces, you are an advocate because you are speaking on behalf of, you are speaking up for the cause, and you're doing more than just patting me on my back and saying, I hear you, girl, I'm so sorry that happened to you, right? So I know that in this space, it's kind of different that I say that because I always talk about being a passive ally, and I think that that is too easy. I think that people have taken on that word and then everybody, well, I'm an ally. So as soon as you say ally, then all of a sudden you have thrown away all the responsibility or the being called a racist, right? Because now you can say, no, I'm not a racist. No, I'm against racism because I'm an ally. We cannot make it that easy for people to just do that. So for me, you need to be an advocate. Now, in being an advocate, one of the things that I talk about is my 4 C's, because people don't really know how to intervene and they don't know how to intervene safely. So the 4 C's, and I'll just go over them quickly, but they're on my website, is to connect. So connect with whoever is being aggressed and let them know that you see them, but also with the aggressor so that they know that they're seen, right? So that you make this connection, and with the other people around you to enroll them into becoming advocates and away from being bystanders. The other thing to do is to create a distraction, and you can do that any number of ways, by words or physical intervention. The third thing is to call for help. So if you're in the workplace, calling for help could mean HR, could mean another coworker, could mean a supervisor, or if you are out on the street, it could be calling 911 or calling for rescue or calling for the other people around you to help. And then the 4th C is to capture the incident. So we saw in the George Floyd incident, they captured the incident. That's how we know what happened, right? They captured it. And the person who was capturing it not just for entertainment, which is what we get a lot, but actually for evidence, right? The way that she captured that video made it so that it was evidentiary valuable. It was valuable evidence that could be used to make sure that these officers were held accountable. Someone says, can I report the 4 C's? Yes, I will repeat them. But so to capture that somebody's, can you mute please, everybody? So make sure that you capture it for evidence. So, and those 4 C's you can use in anything in your daily life, or you can use it in work. So someone asked me to repeat them and I won't. So the first C is to connect. The second C is to create a distraction. The third C is to call for help. And the 4th C is to capture the incident. So I know that we're running short on time. So Simone, I want to just end on that note.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you for sharing those strategies that can be used. Speaking of strategies, let's get over to Liesel before we start opening up for questions. Liesel, last but not least, talk to us please about empathy. How do we add that to our toolkit as well for this season?
Yeah, I come to this conversation out of my position as a workplace empathy consultant. So what that means is I help companies come alongside their people when they experience disruptive life events. And what I find, so that could be a relationship transition, that could be the death of a loved one, a diagnosis. And what I say in my trainings is true also of people as they encounter these heavy conversations about systemic injustice and racism and missing each other, which is, much as people come to grief, it leaves managers and coworkers and friends feeling overwhelmed, they feel under-equipped, and they don't know what to do or say. And this leaves them in a place of paralysis many times. So in my trainings, I look at what is the foundation of the activism that Kelly was just talking about. You know, right action comes out of right listening and attunement. And for so many years, you know, for centuries, the majority culture has not granted, you know, I was just looking at my notes, what so many people bring up, you know, whether that was Keith talking about the actual stories of people or the listening sessions that Dr. Davis is doing. We are not listening to the stories that have been given voice to for so many years. So we look at primary roadblocks that people have to being able to hear what is being said. So the first one is that talking about pain is just hard. And that's something, you know, to get out there, like, it's hard to know how to respond to any sort of pain. In American culture, like, we want people to be happy when we say, how are you doing? We want to hear like, I'm fine, and move on to the next topic. And that tendency is definitely at play in the midst of these conversations. We talk about the founding mythology of the United States, you know, that especially for the majority culture, what we want to see as true about ourselves, and to really unpack, okay, like, what does it mean to say all men are created equal, and who did that actually not include? And looking at some of the history that Keith was talking about. Talk about how personal experience gets in the way or lack of it. We unpack that. And then what I do in my trainings, whether it's talking about supporting people through grief or laying the foundation for these conversations about systemic injustice, is I introduce people to 6 different avatars that affect the way we listen. You've probably run into these people, or you've been these people in the midst of hard conversations. We talk about Silent Sam. He is the worst. Silent Sam is so uncomfortable, so fearful of saying the wrong thing that he just shuts down and doesn't do anything. There is commiserating Candace, who is always wanting to jump in with her own story of how hard things were. If I were talking to a Black woman who said, you know, I'm just so scared walking the streets, I feel unsafe. If I suddenly jump in as a white woman and say, I know exactly how you feel. I feel unsafe walking in Chicago too. You know, I have totally hijacked the story and made it about me. So that's commiserating Candace. We talk about Cheer Up Chero, who always wants you to look on the bright side of things. There's interrogating Edward, who is a jerk. If you've ever encountered him, he wants to pester you with questions to validate your experience. Well, why do you feel that way? I've never felt that way before. You know, he is making the person of color the equivalent of a Google search. There's Buck Up Bobby. Makes a lot of companies, their executive teams have a lot of Buck Up Bobbies. They are a holdover of a past generation who really believed that work and personal life should be separate. They value a stiff upper lip. They don't have time for their emotions or for yours. And finally, there's Fix It Frank, who just wants to jump right to solutions and making things better. And so as we unpack this, what I talk with people about is, you know, you come to empathy conversations with your own established skill set based on how people listened to or did not listen to you as a kid, on your culture of origin. And that empathy actually, it's not a fixed entity. We want to think like, oh, some people are good at listening, some people aren't, and we just shrug our shoulders. But to say, you know, if this is actually a skill set that we value for the success of our companies, we'll teach it. We will break it down into skills that can be acquired, and we'll measure it. And it's vital to this conversation. It's also vital to just how we support our employees in general. People know that they bring their whole selves to the office. And if you miss them in these places of deep pain and loss, you're deeply going to miss them.
Another mic drop. Several mic drops today. Awesome, Liesel, awesome. I feel like I could talk to all of these experts for the whole day and just soak up the knowledge that I'm honored to share on this panel discussion. I do want to move it over to questions, to get some questions in from the audience. So let me go over to Bridget to tell us about some of the questions that are coming in.
Absolutely, Simone. Here's one question, and it's specifically for Mr. Stokes. Let's make sure we have him set and ready to, to take on this answer. So, or take on the question rather. Mr. Stokes, can you suggest where a school would begin to build an education base for all levels of the education settings?
Great question. Thank you. First of all, one of the first platforms to begin is to start with the number of African heritage and historical organizations across the country. Not only in our large cities, but some of the small regional hamlets across the country have largely volunteers who are collecting information, sorting through archives and family heirlooms. And now there's a movement to digitize and make this information more widely available. So the starting point, particularly in African American history or any ethnic history, is to start with those ethnic racial institutions who are really at the ground level collecting that work. From there, you can use that as a starting point or a platform on building units of instruction and curriculum, and then engage some of the larger historical institutions and begin to guide them and work with them so they can share and offer their collections that can complement and supplement and support the type of heritage program that you're putting together. I've been very privileged over the years to work with so many different institutions, not only in America, but through the West Indies and Ghana. And I'm always amazed at how much of this history sits, unfortunately, locked away in stacks and vaults that the average person may not have access to. But today in 2020 going forward, with digitalization and other access techniques, this is at our fingertips, and it can drive a whole new way that young people learn, as I said before, of the history of all of us.
Thank you, Keith, for that. I'll just add one that I know about, an organization called Teaching Tolerance. I believe that they are specifically targeted to educators. And so I believe they have curriculum that you can tap into as well.
Absolutely.
Bridget, you're on mute.
There's another question. I love how Zoom lets you know and gives you this big notice. There's another question too, and I'd like to hear from as many as possible on this one. It's still related to education, but oh my goodness, the richness of your knowledge in this area is just amazing. So the question reads, as a Latinx educator in the elementary classroom, what are some best practices to advocate for Black voices within my school site?
Danielle, would you like to start this one off?
Yeah, I wish there was more simplicity because there's so much work that goes into, it's not just making sure that you're bringing in program or processes that feel like we then tokenize the work. So I'm very mindful of that, but it's really around pushing and advocating for true teacher training and anti-bias work, anti-racist work, and also very specific. If we can't name, we refuse to name the problem, we can't address it. And I think that whoever said that, thank you, because I feel you. For me in my classroom, I would purposely, I'm no longer in secondary elementary, I'm at a higher ed, but my first and foremost is to always make sure that whatever literature, article, pieces we're dissecting and discovering, that Black folk are always at the premier and front end, as are other Indigenous and people of color, around contributions. And I think opening up, that is really critical. Right now, you can't imagine, and without risking confidentiality, I am working with so many schools right now and departments around how to address these inequities that educators themselves are feeling and feel confined because the school or the leadership has not afforded them opportunity to look at literature in the way that makes sense in a contemporary setting, or even answers the call to what is happening. So I'd say obviously doing your own homework, but also infusing work that you know is valuable and that we wouldn't traditionally get for our kids or give to our kids, that we are doing that work.
Thank you, Danielle. The thing that I would add to that is to check out the Inclusion School podcast that I host with Julie Kratz. It's for parents, educators, and caregivers. There's an episode where we interview a principal of a school. And so her name is Dr. Lila J. I think that would be a great episode to check out with how they begun in their school. They had a parent-teacher diversity council, if you will. So there may be some tips in there that you can pick up as well. Let's see if we can get another question in, Bridget.
Absolutely. This one, let's see. So this one's a little lengthy, but I think it's a good one. Several organizations are experiencing backlash for their responses or lack of response around recent racial demonstrations, i.e. giving employees Juneteenth off, putting out an internal or public message. Now, the current employees are confused or offended. The C-suite has asked HR to help resolve this unrest within the organization with a 1-hour Zoom meeting, but HR does not have the skill set to answer these questions, and the company is not willing to allocate resources to bring an external DEI consultant on board. What would you suggest?
Well, you know we're going to Dr. Shirley for this one. Let's start with Dr. Shirley on this one. Thank you, Bridget. It's a good one.
It is, and I have gotten some of those calls. I was like, is that one of my people, one of my clients? Seriously, it has been backlash on both ends, but this is the time now that I am really urging, and I've been working with several CEOs, big companies that are literally calling me and saying, I put this statement out and it fell flat. It was tone deaf and it was too vanilla. That's what they were told. And on the other hand, it was, why did it take you so long to put something out there, right? A week has passed by and nothing has come out. Because again, going back to what we said earlier, silence also sends a message of complicity and apathy and indifference. And so you have to, I know you said you don't have any money, you have to find some money from somewhere, because you don't want, it will do yourselves a lot more of a disservice not to do anything, or to do something and it is an absolute flop because you got the wrong people sending the wrong message. It can also get you in trouble legally as well. I mean, you can say some things or do some things that make people feel discriminated against, excluded, and it could violate their civil rights. So you really have to be sensitive and be willing to make the investment. In the absence of, I just don't have any money, and I've had several people to call me and say we don't have any money, is to refer them to a couple of really good resources that they can use. BlackLivesMatter.com is open and up and available. They put some things out. The African American Museum of Arts has put some stuff out, some talking points that might be able to help you. There's also some really good resources and movies that I'd say to, have people watch and talk about it. If you have an employee resource group or a business resource group inside of your organization, leverage them, or call some of your community partners. One company I was talking to the other day, they had their EAP get involved. So they're doing some sessions on how to deal with trauma and pain and hurt and divisiveness and all of this, but they still weren't hitting on the mark of cultural competence and really talking about racism as it needs to be in a very courageous way. So be sensitive even about your EAPs. And then the last thing I'd say is reach out to some of your community organizations to the extent that you don't have any money, and to see if they would be willing to provide you some of those resources.
If I could just jump in, Simone, real quick.
Yes.
For what Dr. Shirley's saying, so coming from the employment lawyer perspective, it's either pay now or pay later, right? Because these conversations are fraught with litigation, right? That you will say one thing, somebody's going to continue to make comments, these things are going to turn into, I can't say the word, but it's going to turn into a show, right? If you don't know what you're doing and how to handle these conversations. And so while you may think right now you don't have a few $1,000s or whatever to pay a consultant, believe me, you will pay much, much more to hire a lawyer to defend against the claims that are going to be coming, because we were coming back into the workplace worried about corona bias. Now we have to come back into the workplace worried about what's going to happen around these conversations about race and racism, because everybody's not happy about this, right? Everybody is not anti-racist. There are racists among us, and they work for you and they work with you. And so they're not coming to have these conversations and be nice and play nice and, disrupt racism and systemic racism. So if you don't have skilled people having these conversations, you are really exposing yourself to risk and to liability. And speaking of which, don't just have anybody have the conversation. So you might have your HR person. If your HR person is not skilled in how to have these conversations, then again, you're exposing yourself. So people need to stay in their lanes and do what they're qualified to do. And companies, if you have anything where you say that you are committed to diversity, anti-discrimination, any of that, that should already be a part of your strategic plan. So there should be some budget for that. So you need to find the money to make sure that these conversations happen the right way, or else you will end up in court or on, like I say, on the wrong side of the next hashtag movement. So.
Call my number.
What was that?
That was Marcine. She needs to go mute.
Awesome. Just awesome. There has been such valuable knowledge shared. I love the listening sessions that are happening, and I have been asked if, do I need DE&I support to have these conversations. Just a point of clarification, when you're having these conversations, Dr. Shirley and Kelly, this is for the entire organization and not a subset of the organization, correct?
Yeah, it's actually both and. I have been doing them separately, just to FYI. I have requested that the senior executive team and the board of directors not attend with the rest of the staff. So I will do them separate and independently. And most of them don't look like, me, right? So I'll have to either share my lived experience, and maybe there's one on there, but in the absence of not having a person that's African-American who can share lived experiences, we'll share a video or have them read something or look at something prior to the session, and they can react to that. But it is a good idea to separate them from it. We do, though, ask a senior VP or a EVP to come on, kick it off, give their commitment, talk about why it's important, and move on. One quick other thing, too, I want to add to what the last question was about the backlash to and for it, is at the end of the day, companies have got to now make a real shift. This is the time to be courageous, to be bold, and to be unapologetic about standing up for what is right, to standing up what is inclusive, to standing up what is equitable. And really, at the end of the day, this is not a political conversation. This is about humanity and decency. And so when people fight against it and say, I don't think we need to have these conversations, I'm not talking to you. So you don't have to come to, I don't encourage everybody to come. I say this is for the people, the 80% who really want to have a conversation about how we can change the history and the future of our society, right? How we can address our history. So I'm not talking to everybody, and I'm okay with that.
Oh, this has been so good. It has been my absolute honor and pleasure to bring this all-star cast to just drop wisdom. My heart is just filled up right now. Thank you so much for participating. If you love today and if you love the last one, we are going to be doing 2 more panels, one on July 9th and July 20th at the same time at 12 p.m. EST. Registrations will be going out later this week, but just to let you know that there are people that are doing such good work, and there is something that you can do. There is something that everybody can do. And so the next thing I want to share is that my company has a program, Build Your Inclusive Leadership Muscles, that is coming up on July 13th. It's a 6 weeks program, 1 hour by Zoom each week, and we cover topics around inclusive leadership. If you're interested in that, you can go to the SimoneMorrisEnterprises.org website to find out more information. Thank you to everybody that joined this panel. Thank you to our amazing moderator, Bridget McGowan. Thank you, Keith Stokes, Liesel Mertes, Dr. Shirley Davis, Danielle Nava-Mijares, Kelly Charles Collins. This has been fabulous. Any parting words from any of the participants? Anything you'd like to share or say?
This is Keith. Just thank you for this opportunity. I mean, it was a great privilege, but words matter. And my sense is that we don't need toleration, we need equity. So going forward, we should build a more equitable world that all people, regardless of race, religion, or sexual orientation, has equal access to good commerce, good education, and good health care. So it's not toleration, it's equity.
Yeah. And I would say that this is the time to pick a side. So you're either racist or you're anti-racist. And if you're going to be anti-racist, then you need to be an advocate and you need to take action.
And I would say that this is not just a moment, that this is a movement, and we have to make a choice of whether or not we're going to be a monument or be a movement. And we know what they're doing with those monuments. So I encourage us to continue to work forward and making a difference. And I am excited that this is a watershed moment. Stay connected with me on my website at drshirleydavis.com. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Absolutely.
Simone, I want to say thank you so much for including me in this opportunity. And I'm on my journey as a co-conspirator, as an accomplice. I'm ready to do things in different ways, and I'm working very hard because I work in a lot of white-centered spaces. I am working very hard in my own practice to decenter whiteness, because I feel right now that is where I need to do, given the educational realms that I'm in. Advocacy is one that is true to my heart, and I know that it is a journey from allyship to being an advocate, because an advocate is on a whole nother level. So for those of you who are starting out or have claimed some of these words, let's make sure together that we are on the path of doing what is right by this movement and practicing equity and moving away from equality types of feelings, thoughts, and ideas. So thank you to all of you.
Wonderful.
In closing, I encourage people that this is hard work. You're not going to be perfect in this. And in fact, perfection is a standard of white supremacy that's going to get in your way. And I am anchoring people in a quote that I've loved recently by Brené Brown. And she talks about when she gets pushback, her internal mantra that she keeps repeating to herself is, I'm here to get it right and not to be right. And I think that's a great thing to remember. I'm here to get it right and not to be right. And that makes it okay if I get it wrong, to be able to, acknowledge that, apologize, make adjustments, and move forward.
Wonderful. Again, a heartfelt thank you to the panelists, to Bridget, as well as everyone that attended. You will receive an email with the recording plus contact information for each of these panelists. And I'll ask them if they have anything that we want to share with the audience, that I put that in the email as well. Thank you so much for being a part of this important, impactful conversation. Have a good rest of your day.